This week in the Lancet, the first report of a rare strain of HIV in Europe, one of 4 independent cross-species jumps from chimps and gorillas to humans of HIV, blamed on the bushmeat trade in Central Africa. And the reason I bring this up is because how we treat animals can have significant public health implications. And it's not just HIV and bushmeat, but certainly there was SARS in the live animal markets, blamed for its emergence, and the spread of monkeypox, for example, to Wisconsin, thanks to the exotic pet trade. In 2004, the world's 3 leading authorities got together: the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the World Organization for Animal Health, the world's leading veterinary authority, got together, and their job was to uncover the key underlying causes of these emerging animal-to-human diseases. And number 1 on their themes of risk factors was this increasing demand for animal protein the world over. Sure, animals were domesticated 10,000 years ago, but never before like this, as you both will know quite well given the background. So, for example, people remember chickens pecking around in the barnyard, but now chickens raised for meat typically warehoused in sheds containing tens of thousands of birds. Most egg-laying hens in this country and about half around the world are confined in what are called battery cages. These small barren wire enclosures extending down long rows and often windowless sheds can get up to 1 million birds on a single farm. About 45% of the pigs on the planet Earth are also in these intensive confinement operations. The old McDonald's farm has since got replaced, one might say, by the new McDonald's farm. These intensive systems represent perhaps the largest change in the human-animal relations in perhaps 10,000 years. No surprise, perhaps, that they have been implicated as breeding grounds for a number of new emerging diseases. A few snapshots. China in 2005 suffers an unprecedented outbreak of an emerging pig pathogen called strep suis, causing meningitis and deafness in people handling infected pork products. The deadliest strain on record. Where did it come from? Well, the World Health Organization blames in part these intensive conditions in the USDA elaborates. All strep suis starts out harmless, normal gut flora, inadequate ventilation, etc. Can cause the bug to go invasive, causing infections to the brain, blood, lungs, heart, and death. So starts out harmless, turns deadly. That's what these conditions may be able to do with certain pathogens. This is not arguably how animals were meant to live. Pig factories in Malaysia birthed the Nipah virus, a contagious respiratory disease killing 40% of those infected. One of the deadliest pathogens we know. It was actually kind of the model for the Hollywood movie Contagion in terms of the fruit bat to the pig to a contagious respiratory ailment. And again, according to one of the leaders of the field, it seems to be the conditions in which we are now raising these animals. 2009, a strain of Ebola arose. In fact, we farmed in the Philippines, confining 6,000 pigs. This is Ebola restin, the strain found in the hot zone, so airborne Ebola, but it does not seem to be able to transmit to people, given enough time to mutate in people, though who knows, so they threw them all in pits and put them in water. What better example of the link between how we treat animals and potential public health implications than our investigation at the Humane Society of the United States of this dairy cow slug plant in Southern California, which led to the largest meat recall in human history, 133 million pounds of beef, because they're violating food safety rules meant to protect the public from bovine spongiform encephalopathy, a disease that wouldn't even exist had it not been for factory farming practices. Why? Because we took herbivores, cows and sheep, turned them into carnivores and cannibals by feeding them slaughterhouse waste, blood, and manure. Then we killed down animals too sick to even stand and fed them to people, and that's we feed antibiotics by the truckload to farm animals. Here's the total amount of antibiotics used for all of human medicine every year here in the United States. Contrast that with the amount that's fed to animals, healthy animals, just to prevent disease and promote growth in such stressful and unhygienic environments. Millions of pounds a year. Now, such use has its advocates and its opponents. The feeding of clinically important human antibiotics to farm animals has been condemned, just to fatten faster, condemned, I'm sorry, let me just take a step back and just note that half the pigs so far have been tested positive here in the U.S. at MRSA, and so-called superbug killing more people than AIDS every year here in the United States. As Britain's chief medical officer put it in his annual report, every inappropriate use of antibiotics in agriculture potentially signing a death warrant for a future patient. And here's the opponents and advocates. This practice is condemned of feeding antibiotics, human antibiotics, to animals, human class antibiotics, opposed by the American Medical Association, approved by the American Meat Institute. The American Academy of Pediatrics is against it. The National Turkey Federation is for it. On one hand, you have the American Public Health Association, the largest and oldest association of public health professionals in the world. And on the other side, you have the American Sheep Industry Association. The National Academy of Sciences, Institute of Medicine, opposed. The National Chicken Council in favor. On one hand, you have the World Health Organization, and on the other, the National Pork Producers Council. To be fair, though, certainly the beef producers and the egg producers are also in favor, but this practice has been condemned by nearly every medical organization in the country. Yet, the industrial animal agriculture continues this dangerous practice. Now, sometimes they feed antibiotics, arsenic-containing drugs, that you see in this chicken report, thanks to Pew, and other drugs, but sometimes they don't feed them anything at all. Forced starvation molting, where laying hens have food withheld for up to weeks at a time, water withheld for days. They lose up to a third of their body weight, but what they do is kind of shock the bird's systems into another round of laying before they are killed. And so, yes, there's a huge increase in stress and suffering and morbidity and mortality. But for our purposes here, what does it do to salmonella? Normally it takes up to 56,000 colony units or salmonella bacteria to cause infection, but starved hens, as few as 10 bacteria, not 6,500, not 56,000, but 10 bacteria can cause infection of these immunocompromised hens, and then once they are infected, they shed 10,000 times more salmonella. Why would the industry do this? Why would they place the public at risk? Well, we don't want to answer to that. Of course, the first and foremost reason is to improve profits. Remember the big egg recall last year? 500 million eggs recalled for salmonella last year. Well, according to Egg Industry Magazine, it may have been because of the post-Easter induction of mold using starvation. And as I said, why would they do that? Well, the industry, of course, is very clear on why they would do that. And it's the same reason why laying hens are kept confined in battery cages, barren battery cages. But in 29 days from today, the entire European Union, 27 countries, is going to ban these cages. What effect will this have on public health? Well, they were, of course, very concerned about this, so they took 30,000 samples from 5,000 farms to see what is the relative risk by housing of salmonella. Here's the results. This is what they found. Salmonella enteritidis, compared to keeping birds in cages, those kept in cage conditions have 43% lower odds, 95% lower odds, 98% lower odds in free range, and 95% lower odds in organic production. So by eliminating the riskiest method of production, this would be, the European Union is expecting this will improve the safety of their eggs. Meanwhile, here in the United States, the FDA estimates that salmonella-contaminated eggs sickens 142,000 Americans every year. That's an egg-borne epidemic each year, but nothing compared to, for example, swine flu. So this is the 2009 pandemic. 60 million Americans sick. Let me talk about swine flu for a bit because it's such an important topic. So it apparently emerged, and I'm trying to go into this, emerged in 1918. There was never a pig recorded with influenza before that, and stable through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, completely stable, which is really quite phenomenal for an RNA-based virus. And everything changed, though, in 1999, where a triple species flu virus arose, never before described here in the United States, and that was actually the primary progenitor of the pandemic virus that would emerge a little over a decade later. So after 8 decades of stability, what happened in the 1990s that led to these unprecedented changes, evolution and fast forward for these swine flu viruses, and the same thing can be said for bird flu viruses. No human deaths were made in influenza for 80 years until 1997 when H5N1 started killing people in Hong Kong and in the Netherlands. In 2002 there was H7N7, which went on to infect thousands of people with human-human transmission. You don't think about it much because this is when SARS was raging at the time. These are just 2 examples of these newly emerging avian influenza viruses. In poultry, the number of outbreaks of highly pathogenic or highly disease-causing avian influenza in just the first few years of this century already exceeded the total number of outbreaks for the entire previous century. As one leading scientist said, in science, we've gone from kind of a few snowflakes to an avalanche. Right? And the question is why? What could be happening in recent years to trigger these kind of changes in the epidemiology and ecology of both swine and chicken flu viruses? And one can ask the world's leading expert, Dr. Robert Webster, as did the senior correspondent of NewsHour, Jim Lair, was there something qualitatively different about this last decade that made it possible for this disease to do something it's never done before, some kind of changing conditions that suddenly lit a match to the tinder? Webster replied. He says, farming practices have changed. He talks about growing up on a farm. He says, now, we put millions of chickens into a chicken factory next door to a pig factory. This virus has the opportunity to get into one of these chicken factories and make billions and billions of these mutations continuously. And so what we've changed is the way we raise animals and our interaction with those animals. And he talks about the viruses escaping from these factories, infecting wild birds. He says that's what's changed. We've changed the way we raise animals. According to the world's leading agriculture authority, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the acceleration of human influenza problems in recent years, which has been kind of snowflakes to an avalanche in people too, is expected to largely relate to the intensification of poultry production and possibly pig production as well. There are at least 10 reasons why these CAFOs, these confined animal feeding operations, present such breeding ground for disease. I will just touch on one. The operation in New Grove, North Carolina, where our first hybrid swine flu virus arose in August 1998, was a breeding facility in which thousands of pigs were confined in what are called Gestational Crates, also known as Stielow stalls. Which are these kind of deal crate-like barren metal cages about 2 feet wide, where these highly intelligent social animals basically kept in a box, right? Week after week, month after month. They can develop crippling joint deformities, lameness. If we did this to a dog and we were thrown in jail, not only can these animals barely move, but turn around, they can barely move at all. And for our purposes here, it's this rise in stress hormones in crated sows that is thought to be caused by this interference with the expression of normal maternal behaviors like nest building, and it's this frustration of these normal maternal behaviors that has been blamed for the decreased immunity in these animals. Measures as simple as providing straw for these animals has shown to significantly decrease morbidity and mortality compared to these concrete slided floors presumably by eliminating the immunosuppressive stress applying on bare concrete their whole lives, which may lead to increased infection risk. That minimal act, providing straw, has been shown to decrease the risk of swine flu. And for anyone who's German, is a bit rusty, risk factors significantly associated with influenza virus infection compared to these concrete sided floors, providing straw has infection risk by about 2.5 times. This minimal act, like providing straw, has been shown to help get, we often deny these animals even this modicum of mercy, not only to their detriment, but potentially to others as well. The National Livestock and Meat Board defends intensive confinement in a pamphlet called Facts from the Meat Board. Confinement rearing has its precedents. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't see this. It says, schools are example of confinement rearing of children. Well, what's the problem? Not that different from how they describe veal crates as similar to a baby's crib. The fact that the industry feels the need to conjure images of baby cribs in classrooms speaks to how far out of step modern animal agriculture has gone from mainstream values of just basic decency towards other animals. And they know it. As a professor emeritus of animal science wrote in one of his college textbooks, one of the best things animal agriculture has going for it, modern animal agriculture, is that most people haven't a clue how animals are raised, right? For modern animal agriculture, the less the consumer knows about what happens before meat hits their plate, the better. Now, our greatest concern is that somewhere in a pig where H5N1 is endemic in Asia or Africa, will become co-infected with both the endemic swine flu and the highly pathogenic H5N1, but theoretically resulting in the virus with the human transmissibility of H1N1 and the human lethality of H5N1, which currently is about 60%. And imagine 61 million Americans being infected with a virus with a 60% mortality rate. What can we do to prevent this kind of thing in the future? Well, the United Nations has urged all governments, local authorities, international agencies need to take a greatly increased role in combating the role of factory farming, which combined with these live bird markets provides ideal conditions for the virus to spread and mutate into a more dangerous form. These so-called CAFOs can be thought of as incubators for the original emergence of dangerous strains of the flu. And then once a new virus emerges, these CAFOs can act as amplifiers of influenza. The scientists at the University of Iowa Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases concluded a human influenza epidemic due to a new virus can be locally amplified by the presence of confined animal feeding operations in the community. So no wonder that the American Public Health Association has called for no more CAFOs, calling for a moratorium many years ago. And in 2007, the Journal of the APHA published an editorial that went beyond just calling for de-intensification of the pork and poultry industries. They questioned the prudence of raising so many animals for food in the first place. It is curious, therefore, that changing the way humans treat animals, most basically ceasing to eat them, or at the very least radically limiting the quantity of them that are eaten, is largely off the radar. Right? Such a change, if sufficiently adopted or enforced, can still reduce the chances of a much feared influenza epidemic, be more likely to prevent unknown future diseases that in the absence of this change may result from farming animals intensely and killing them for food. Yet, humanity doesn't even consider this option. We don't tend to shore up the levees until after the disaster. The editorial concludes those who consume animals not only harm those animals, but endanger themselves and may threaten the well-being of future generations. To switch avian images, it's time for humans to remove their heads from the sand and recognize the risk to themselves that can arise from maltreatment of other species. CAFOs represent an efficient method of production, but may not be worth the risk. And the chief benefit, which is cheap meat, is in fact contributing to the slow motion disaster the world is facing, according to the World Health Organization. This was just in the Journal of Chronic Diseases, such as heart disease and diabetes, as we kind of globalize the Western diet around the world. The WHO blames the rapid increase in the consumption of animalized foods, many of which produced under these intensive CAFO conditions, which combined with cigarette smoke threatens to really undermine the health gains made throughout the developing world. Here's a graphic based on an early swine flu mortality update. Even combining all these communicable diseases together, the mortality does not reach heart disease, and which can not only be prevented and stopped, but even reversed with a plant-based diet. And this is the doc that got President Clinton eating healthier. This is a policy conference, though. So what can be done on a population level? And let me end with a nationwide success story. After World War II, Finland joined us in packing on meat, eggs, and dairy. By the 1970s, Finland had the highest mortality rate for heart disease in Finnish men, the highest in the world. So they didn't want to die, so they got serious. Heart disease is caused by high cholesterol, and high cholesterol, specifically LDL cholesterol, is the number one risk factor for our number one killer, heart disease. And what causes your LDL to go up? Saturated fat intake. So the goal of their program was to reduce the saturated fat intake in Finland. So a berry project was launched. Oh, excuse me. So what does that mean? What is saturated fat? Well, that's basically cheese, chicken, cake, and pork. If you look at what we're doing here in the United States. So what they did, well, they had this berry project launched to help dairy farmers switch to berry farmers, and indeed they did switch from dairies to berries. They had villages pitted against one another to see a cholesterol lowering competition, to see which village could have lower cholesterol. Okay, so how'd they do it? Well, look, on a population scale, even if mortality rates just bump a little bit, right, you could save thousands of lives. But what they did was really, truly remarkable. And what they found was an 80% drop in cardiac mortality. 80% drop in cardiac mortality across the entire country, with greatly reduced cardiovascular and cancer mortality. All-cause mortality was reduced about 45%, leading to greater life expectancy, about 7 years in men and 6 years in women. This is what good dietary guidelines could do for various countries. And now vying for the world record, heart disease mortality, the United States of America. CAFOs and their cheap meat have public health implications. For more of the chronic disease implications, please feel free to check out my website, nutritionfacts.org, where I have hundreds of videos on over 1,000 topics. Everything's free, it's not commercial, science-based, lists all the citations, links to all the PDFs, etc. For my infectious disease, for the infectious disease work, I encourage people to read my review and critical reviews of my biology. You have to send anyone a PDF. You can email me, mhg1, just the number 1@cornell.edu. I also have a stack of some DVDs, closed captioned in 5 languages, if anyone's interested. And if you'd like to read my book, it too is available free. My latest book on the subject, free at birdflubook.org. Thank you so much for your attention.
Please.
Most gruesome talk I've seen so far. So, in the context of going back to international development and looking at the increase in demand for animal protein globally, I'm curious what the cost difference is between, for instance, a battery cage raised hen versus a free-range hen, and how can we address those issues in developing countries where, you know, we may be able to have some influence on which types of animal proteins they choose, but that demand's still going to be there, and I don't know how we're going to change that. So how do we meet that demand if we're not doing these intensive agriculture? Is it practical with doing a free-range scenario or some other techniques?
So the United Egg Producers came up with an estimate that that cage reproduction cost a little less than a penny per egg, about 11.5 cents per dozen more. Now, for an industry that produces literally tens of billions of eggs every year, that's just unthinkable. But for an average consumer to spend an extra 12 cents on a dozen eggs, it's not necessarily something that they will do. So it's just this kind of, it's a niche market, right? So they're able to charge twice as much for the cage-free eggs, etc. But in terms of actual production methods, it's really not that great based on the industry's own estimates. And so it is possible to be able to produce animal products in more welfare-friendly systems in ways that on kind of a large scale. Although the price differential is actually a good thing, right? How do you get people to stop smoking? Right? The best way we figured out how to do it is increase the price of cigarettes. That's why cigarette taxes are so effective. In fact, it's like an equation. You increase 10 cents cigarette tax, and you're going to save this many line. And so, the fact that these products are so cheap may be detrimental and have other costs for society on a public health basis, like obesity in China, diabetes in China, India. Diabetes epidemics are skyrocketing as they're moving away from the kind of traditional plant-based diets and incorporating more of this kind of cheap intensive products. And so in terms of overall cost, one has to think, well, what are the true costs of cheap meat? What costs is the industry kind of externalizing on to society? And I think we'll actually hear much more about that.
It's a good segment.
Okay. Let's see if I can figure out what goes on.
We'll just advance this advance it.
Okay, all right. So I've got a few slides. Let's see. But I just thought I'd start by, I'm with the Pew Environment Group. We're the environmental advocacy arm of the Pew Charitable Trust, and sort of, how Pew got engaged in this issue. And in 2005, the trust, along with the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, set up a commission. We've done this before on ocean policy issues, on other important public policy issues. So they had an independent commission looking at industrial farm animal production. Overall, it was a pretty diverse group with folks from government, business, agriculture, rural advocacy, animal welfare, a range of folks, everywhere from, I believe, a former governor of Kansas, former Secretary of Agriculture. They met for about a 2-year period, and they held public meetings around the country. They visited a variety of operations and had technical reports in detail on some aspects of these. They essentially reviewed, they also had hearings, so they ended up reviewing thousands of pages of communications, and they released a report, and I've got the executive summary version here, and I've got a couple of them on the table. And what their report looked at, these broad areas of public health, animal welfare, environment, and rural communities, and this afternoon I just wanted to hit briefly on the environment part, and probably mostly on the water part is what I'm going to look at. And so, obviously from the outset, I recognize that for a lot of folks, if you look at this picture of agriculture, and I worked in a rural county trying to keep that picture of agriculture, trying to do farmland preservation in a county, actually it's ex-urban county, this area. You look at that picture and it's really, just the notion that it causes environmental problems just doesn't ring true. But particularly if you compare it with some of these images, you might ask, as the ag industry's PR folks have been doing lately, when did agriculture become a dirty word? And to that, I'd have to say that we don't believe that agriculture is a dirty word. I also don't believe that oil drilling is a dirty word. Don't believe that mining is a dirty word, that car manufacturing or widget making activities can have, dirty byproducts, and if they're not controlled adequately, create serious environmental problems. So if you look at agriculture going from that to that, from this to this, and this to this, the trouble is that our policies have not kept pace with the change in this country in terms of our policies have been evolving really exceedingly slow and not kept pace with basically the industrialization of agriculture. So most of our meat today comes from these kinds of operations, the kind of operations that Michael was showing you pictures of. And, as he said, we're not talking a little McDonald's. It's a little more Henry Ford, maybe. But while the business giants have scaled up and industrialized meat production, our policies haven't kept pace. If we look at, if you compare that idyllic farm, the diversified farm, that offered you an opportunity to balance sort of inputs and outputs from a farming operation, livestock and crops. CAFOs, concentrated or confined animal feeding operations, they basically a lot of times divorce the production of livestock from the crop raising, and they may even specialize in a single animal or a single phase in the animal's life. As Michael said, it's a program that it's a model that's hailed as efficient, but it transfers costs, and those are just some of the kinds of environmental costs. And basically, we're looking at a matter of scale, and we're also looking at regional concentration. While smaller farming operations obviously have waste, it's not in the same volume. The amount of waste produced at many of these CAFOs far exceeds that in human communities. And while municipal sewage is treated to kill pathogens, remove harmful pollutants, it's not the case for manure on many of these facilities. Now, obviously, it makes sense to use basically it makes sense to use manure where you can, and the simple solution of storing manure for use on cropland, it works in some environments for some scales. But today, we assume that that's feasible, even though we have regions with producing far more manure than can reasonably be used. So you end up with too much manure applied, you end up with manure applied at the wrong times. And of course, that has results. With eutrophication, you have excess manure running off of farm fields, seeping into groundwater, harmful algae blooms, depriving the fish of oxygen, and manure management can spell a lot of trouble from shellfish condemnations, beach closures, drinking water contamination. In fact, EPA has estimated that the drinking water sources of some 43% of our population have actually suffered some level of pathogen contamination associated with CAFOs. Now, obviously, not all of these kind of problems, you can have these kind of problems come from a variety of sources. But according to the U.S. Geological Survey, livestock manure is the single largest source of nitrogen pollution in several major rivers and watersheds across the country. Government researchers have also found there are large livestock operations are strongly associated with the regions of the country where manure is in excess of what local crops can use. You've got manifestation of this in pretty much across the country. I just picked 4. I don't want to be reading and reading, but whether you're talking Arkansas, Texas, having problems, Oklahoma, that hotbed of environmentalism, going after their neighboring Arkansas because of problems in poultry litter pollution. Close by, the area of the Delmarva Peninsula has long been known for poultry production and has many of those large broiler operations. unfortunately, too many of them producing more manure than can be used on cropland in the Bay watershed. In 2004, there was an EPA scientific committee that reported that key watersheds in the Bay region rank in the top 10% of watersheds studied for pollution that are associated with confined livestock and poultry operations. And if you look at material from the state of Delaware, you see that they have significant problems with nitrate in their groundwater. I think a lot of folks that are in the agricultural areas in Delaware know not to, make baby formula with the well water. And you've got phosphorus levels, building up in the soils there. There was a recent study that looked at bay cropland fertilized with manure and found that if you looked at land that was fertilized with manure versus chemical fertilizer, where it's fertilized with manure, almost 100% of that land was not getting the kind of practices in terms of rate, timing, and method of application that they should be. So the need was most acute problem with the manure minerals.
Is that because the cost of the manure is much less than the chemical fertilizer, so they just put more on the media?
Well, it's that, plus they got to do something with it. If you've got, you've got another flock of chickens coming in, you've got to clean out, you've got too much manure, so you're putting it on just, and you may be able to sell it. Some kind of manure you can sell and can be used for other uses, but in a lot of instances, you just got too much concentrated regional. So basically what we're after and what we're looking at these days are several sort of policy items. What we're saying is it's time for some parity here. This is that where these operations have become industrial operations, they are industry. It's not saying they shouldn't exist. It is saying you've got to have regulation that's on par with the kind of industrial regulation that you would have for any other kind of industry. One of the first things we think is important is, I say, taking count here, and what I mean by that is EPA has had a very difficult time just sort of figuring out, well, how many do we have, where are they, how much manure is being produced. So EPA right now has a rule proposal out that is very controversial. That would simply require people to raise their hand and say, here I am, here's the kind of animals I have, and here's how much manure I produce, and here's how much I use on my crops, and here's how much I have to give away. So, second thing is the industry has fought having Clean Water Act permits. Clean Water Act permits start you down a path of accountability, and there has been a big fight about having permits. And we say, come on, the biggest of these facilities really need to have permits. The other thing is that policy-wise, we need to find cross-media solutions. And by that, I mean, you can't say, well, okay, I'll deal with this water problem and let it be an air problem, which is sort of what happened when a lot of those big facilities moved to North Carolina. They built these large lagoons, and okay, they don't have to worry about not having enough cropland to use all the nitrogen in the manure they're going to spray, because the nitrogen has dissipated as ammonia off into the air. So you got to find cross-media solutions. The other thing that happens is in the regulatory world, we're not looking at what happens to the waste they give away. Where we do actually give a permit to the folks, we say, well, we're only going to look at the waste that you put on cropland that's under your control. But if you give it to your neighbor, if you sell it to a broker, then that's fine. Okay, it's out of the system. The other thing is measuring and disclosing. One of the arguments you get into, like for example in the Bay, the Chesapeake Bay cleanup using one of the most sophisticated computer models created for a watershed, but that Bay model has data from sewage treatment plants because you measure. You're measuring and you're monitoring and you're getting data, and the rest of it is sort of estimates. So we have to start doing a better job of measuring, doing monitoring programs, and disclosing that information. By taking accountability to the top, what I mean is that a lot of times these operations, they're sort of franchises. They're not, you know, a small grower guy, he does this to have some extra money, he builds a big house, but he's a contractor, and he's told when the birds are coming, what birds they are, you know, what to feed. He's given the feed, he's told what to feed them. The antibiotics in the feed are not his choice. So, but yet, he has to be responsible for the management of the manure. We can say, wait. You know, if you're going to have that, then the person from Tyson's, from Smithfield, from Purdue needs to sign a permit and needs to be legally, liably responsible for the manure management as well. And recognizing limits, what I'm talking about is what we'd like to see is you have to recognize that in some areas you end up with so many of these large operations that it's out of kilter with what the local land crops can use. And so that we have to start recognizing that. There's, for example, in California, I looked at a county that did an analysis, and they looked at nitrogen and they looked at salts, and they said, okay, if you look at our county, how much can we bear of this? And then they set a limit on dairy operations so that you know, they won't have new additional dairy operations beyond a certain number, because they're trying to basically limit the operations to what their community environment can bear. So those are the kind of policies we think that we should be talking about in regulating this industry.
Recognizing that it must be very difficult to unsure and case out more data. I'm thinking, when you mentioned that there was phosphorus and nitrogen were at greater levels and 43% you said are rivers.
Water supplies for pathogens have experienced pathogen.
Do we know that's manure related as opposed to just fertilizer that came from crops?
Well, the 43% was a number that EPA estimated, and that was pathogens. And so I believe it was manure related. Now, to what extent, you know, sometimes it's hard to, you know, I don't know, I'm old enough to remember, was it in the 90s or when the city of Milwaukee had a terrible drinking water crisis. And they had cryptosporidium, and I'm not sure that they ever determined exactly where it came from, but there was, you know, concern that it was livestock operations upstream that put those pathogens there. So, you know, you can't, I don't think it's going to be as easy if you don't have a treatment works with a pipe. You're not going to have the same kind of monitoring. But I think that our networks of monitoring can be enlarged and improved so we can get a better handle on some of these things.
It's fascinating, but it's perhaps equal to more than profitability in some ways.
Right.
Thank you, Velma.
Thanks.
We're running a little tight on time with our apologies to Bruce, so. Sorry. We have one more panelist for this session. Yes. We go until 4 o'clock.
Okay.
About 15 minutes.
The effect of confined animal feeding operations on animals is simultaneously it's sort of the obvious one because it actually has the word animal, confined animal feeding operation, but it's also the one that oftentimes requires a little bit more explanation with regard specifically to why we should care. So for example, you can see from the National Review on the right, to the Nation on the left, they will do cover stories on factory farms, and they'll talk about the health effects, and they'll talk about dual-use antibiotics, and they'll talk about the environmental effects. And even though they're talking about factory farms, there might be pictures of the animals. They won't talk about the effect of confined animal feeding operations on animals. So they're oftentimes left out. If you just want to say a couple of words about why animals matter, why the effect of confined animal feeding operations, why the effect on animals is important. And The science on this is absolutely clear. Going all the way back to Darwin on the left, what we know to be true is that differences between human beings and other species of animal, they're differences of degree, they're not differences of kind. So for example, other species of animal, they're made of flesh and blood and bone, just like human beings are. They have the same 5 physiological senses that we do. So basically they're more like us than they're unlike us. And foremost living evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins on the right argues that other species of animals are our evolutionary cousins, basically. That from an evolutionary standpoint, they are our family. In recent years, you've seen more and more, not enough, but a fair bit of pathology that has been done with farm animals specifically, looking at their capacities. So you have books like Pleasurable Kingdom by Dr. Jonathan Balcom, in which he talks about not farm animals specifically, but he talks about pigs and chickens within the context of challenging the idea that is oftentimes posited that for other animals life is nasty, brutish, and short. Or for other animals it's all red and tooth and claw. It's purely on the basis of instinct. And he goes into some depth in on the basis of his observational research into the fact that other animals do an awful lot of things that do not have any evolutionary reason. They do it because they enjoy it. They do it because they like it. Back with Richard Dawkins, Dawkins argues that other species, just like cognition has developed in human beings, and empathy and emotion, and all of the things that apply to us that oftentimes scientists will argue do not apply to other species, he calls that speciesist arrogance, and says that evolution has worked in human beings and in other animals in the same way. So it's not the case, as these 3 researchers will tell us, it's not the case that human beings are the only species that experiences joy, or human beings are the only species that can reflect on morality, or human beings are the only species that can reflect on the future. And in fact, more and more, what we find to be true is that these are capacities that we share in relative degrees with other species. So for example, in the inner world of farm animals, they talk about research at the University of Bristol that has been done with chickens, in which they found that chickens have the capacity to delay gratification. And the researchers said that other than non-human primates, chickens are the first species in which they found this capacity. And it's not that chickens have the capacity and dolphins or elephants don't. It's that pathology is in its infancy. And as Temple Grandin says in Animals in Translation, every time scientists have set out to prove human uniqueness, every time scientists have said, here are things that other animals can't do, and we're going to prove it with science, they've consistently failed. And she suggests that when they have been successful, it has not been a failure of the animals, it has been a failure of the scientists, because our understanding of evolutionary biology is such, as Dawkins teaches us, and as we should have known from Darwin, that we can recognize that the same capacities we have, other species have. And really, for any of us who spend our lives with a cat or a dog, this simply confirms the intuition that we already have. We know that our dogs and cats are reflecting on their own lives. We know that our dogs and cats have individuality and capacities that, although not the same as ours, are similar in kind to ours. So, but what we found with the pathologists, what we found with the people who are actually doing the animal behavior research with dogs, with chickens and pigs and sheep and goats and other farm animals, is that in fact farm animals, the pigs and the chickens, outperform the dogs and the cats on cognition tests. The cat lovers like my wife will say that the cats are refusing to participate. They're above the research, but dogs like chompers are trying. And nevertheless, the pigs and the chickens are learning from television and learning how to accomplish tasks and delaying gratification and doing things that are beyond the capacities of dogs and beyond the willingness to participate, if you want to go that way, of cats. So all of that is a sort of the basis of why organizations like Farm Sanctuary, the Humane Society of the United States, the ASPCA, and other groups that work on animal welfare, why we focus a fair bit of our attention on confined animal feeding operations. If you take all of the animals who suffer and die in the United States and you put them all, into a pie chart, 99% of them are farm animals. In the United States, we eat 10 billion farm animals every single year. That actually excludes fish. We eat probably twice that number of fish, especially if you're going to include shellfish within your calculation. But in terms of land animals, we eat in the United States 10 billion farm animals. We farm and slaughter 10 billion animals every single year, which is 99% of the animals who suffer and die. So we're a nation of animal lovers, and yet our number one relationship with animals is when we literally dine on them. And when you look at factory farming, confined animal feeding operations, that is more than 99% of all of the animals who are raised and slaughtered. More than 99% of them are on confined animal feeding operations. This is the myth. So this is what, if you go out and you poll people and you ask people, how strong, what do you think about farm animal welfare? Should there be strong laws to protect farm animals? And 70% of people will say yes, there should be strong laws. And in fact, almost 70% of people say the laws to protect chickens and pigs and other farm animals should be identical to the laws that protect dogs and cats. And yet, the next question is, well, what do you think of the current laws? Are they satisfactory? Do they need to be stronger? Should they be weaker? The vast majority of people think that the current laws are satisfactory. What that means is that most people in society think that the current legal protections for farm animals are identical or almost as strong as the legal protection for dogs and cats. And yet, what is actually true is that the legal protection for farm animals is non-existent. There is no protection for farm animals from anything that's standard agricultural practice. And standard agricultural practice on factory farms would warrant felony cruelty to animals charges where dogs and cats similarly abused. So this is how mother pigs are kept, and you saw a fair bit of video footage of this in Dr. Greger's presentation as well. But this is how more than half of pregnant pigs spend their entire gestation in crates where they can't even turn around. Their muscles and bones atrophy. They go psychologically insane in these conditions. It would be, if you did this to a dog or a cat, obviously felony level cruelty to animals. And yet this is how most pregnant pigs spend their entire gestations. And actually this isn't a very good slide, but we already saw it in both Velma's and Michael's presentations. But these are just massive numbers of pigs, and this is how they're going to spend their entire lives. Pigs are so drugged up now that most of them are lame by the time they reach the slaughterhouse. They have no psychological stimulation, they have no physiological stimulation, they are cooped in their own excrement for their entire lives, and on the backs of transport trucks, we slaughter about 100 million pigs in this country every single year, and on the backs of transport trucks, more than 1% of them arrive at the slaughterhouse either crippled or dead because they have spent their entire lives standing around like this. They get loaded onto the backs of the transport trucks through all weather extremes, and because they have been so muscled up, they can't actually make the journey without literally collapsing under their artificial bulk or actually dying from the journey. This is what non-factory farmed pigs look like. They've actually got some of the straw that Dr. Greger was talking about. They're able to move about. It's not Old MacDonald's farm exactly, but this is the alternative that groups like Farm Sanctuary and the ASPCA and the HSUS are encouraging corporations to move toward. And as you can see, there are still things, even on things like Joel Salatin's farm, Polyface Farm, which Michael Pollan talks about in very positive terms in Omnivore's Dilemma. Even on Joel Salatin's farm, the male babies are tossed alive into grinders of egg-laying hens. The pigs have their ears, as you can see. It's for identification. They actually take, basically wire cutters and mutilate their ears. Their tails are chopped off, again, without pain relief. They're shipped to the same slaughterhouses, actually, of the factory farmed pigs. So it's still abuses, even on the so-called best farms, the 1%, the abuses are still such that where dogs or cats treated similarly, you would see felony cruelty to animals charges levied. But the difference between this, and certainly the difference between that and this, is significant for the animals involved. And it's the difference between a life of unmitigated misery and really a life that is at least not nearly that bad. And these are a couple of piglets at Farm Sanctuary. The organization that I run, we actually have 3 farm animal sanctuaries, 1 in New York and 2 in California, and we do sanctuary and provide shelter for farm animals. This is Fiona and that's Linus. They were dropped off at a shelter in San Francisco, and the shelter brought them to our Orland, Northern California shelter. And Fiona is still doing very well. Unfortunately, Linus is very ill and passed away within a couple of days after this photo was taken. You saw some photos of this as well. This is how 95% of hens in the United States are kept. This is what's going to be illegal across the European Union in less than a month. But 95% of the 300 almost million hens in the United States are kept in 18 by 20 inch wire mesh cages, 100,000 or more hens in a shed. And a hen has a wingspan of 30 to 32 inches, so each hen has a wingspan of about that. They cram an industry average of 5 of them into 18 by 20 inch wire mesh cages. Each one has 72 square inches for her entire life. This is what I was talking about a moment ago, where more than 100 million male babies are tossed alive into what's called macerators, grinders, and that happens even for the so-called free-range and cage-free facilities. But the animals, by the time they're shipped to slaughter, their muscles and bones have so thoroughly atrophied that on a journey to slaughter, more than a third of them suffer new bone breaks just on a trip to the slaughter. Because imagine, spending your entire life in the chairs that you're sitting in. You're there for 18 to 24 months, you don't move, your muscles and bones waste away. By the time you're put on the back of a transport truck and taken to slaughter, the likelihood is that you're going to break something. And in fact, sure enough, a third of these animals do suffer new bone breaks on the way to slaughter. This is how chickens are treated, and you actually saw better. I need to get with Michael and get some of his slides if you saw better images of this. It's more clear here. But it's a carpet of chickens. And this is how, in the United States, we slaughter 9 billion chickens. I said 10 billion farm animals, 9 billion of them are chickens. So we slaughter 100 times as many chickens as pigs. We slaughter 250 times as many chickens as cattle. And they have no protection at any point in their lives. And chicken genetics, chicken breeding and drugging, we give twice as many drugs, growth-promoting drugs to chickens as to pigs or cattle by weight, and by volume actually. And by the time they're shipped to slaughter at less than 7 weeks old, their muscles and bones are 6 to 7 times, their upper bodies are 6 to 7 times as large as they were just 50 years ago. So that they suffer from 1% death losses in these conditions every week, because their upper bodies are so massive, but their hearts give out, or their lungs collapse, or their legs cripple, and they can't get to water under their artificially massive bulk. And Agricultural Journal some years back, they said if a human baby grew as quickly as a modern broiler chicken, by the time she was 2 years old, she would weigh more than 250 pounds. And chickens, just like human beings, they don't have super physiology. What that means is that all of them are suffering chronic misery through their entire lives. The novelist Alice Walker says eating chickens is eating misery, because their entire lives are categorized by suffering. This is what's called a colony cage, and so it's a bunch of chickens in a colony cage. It's still cages, but the animals actually do have some room to explore, and they do have some room to move around. One of the legislative priorities for my organization, as well as Michael's organization, as well as the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the ASPCA, our big farm animal national legislative priority for next year is to get rid of these and to move to these. And what it means is the animals can, the cages are about 20 times as large, and what it means is that each bird has about 100 times the space. And so that's our big federal legislative priority. This is a chicken who was just dropped off at Farm Sanctuary last week at our Los Angeles facility. And what you can see, the reason I put this up, in addition to the fact that she is just crazy cute, is look at how massive her upper body is. This chicken is probably about 3 or 4 weeks old. She is a baby. She is cheeping like a baby. She is a Franken chicken. A few years ago, the Washington Post did a story about turkeys and the fact that turkeys can't breathe naturally. Their upper bodies are so massive, and they called it techno turkey, serving up science for dinner. And that is literally what confined animal feeding operations are doing to and more than 9 billion birds every single year. So the thing is, though, that just like we have near unanimity on the importance of having concern for the environment, and we have near unanimity on the importance of moving toward health concerns and incorporating health concerns into the way that we're raising animals, we have 97% of Americans, according to Gallup, saying that they care about cruelty to animals. 97% of Americans don't agree on anything, right? I mean, even the libertarians think we shouldn't be abusing animals. Everybody agrees. And our problem, though, is that this is what a factory farm looks like, where some of the slides that you saw in Velma and Michael's presentations, the aerial slides of the factory farms. Who here has seen a chicken on the side of the road when you're driving in the country in the last 10 years? I mean, occasionally you'll see some cattle, occasionally you'll see a dairy cow, but pigs and chickens, it's 100% integrated, right? So you never see them on the side of the road. They're all in these massive buildings, and they're all slaughtered in these massive buildings. The solution to the problem is that we all become superheroes for animals. At Farm Sanctuary, we work very closely with the Humane Society of the United States and the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Our big legislative priorities are to get rid of the gestation crates and the battery cages, which you saw both in my presentation as well as in Dr. Greger's presentation. The battery cages, there is federal legislation that we're going to be working on. The gestation crates and the veal crates, there should be probably 4 or 5 state legislatures that will be considering bans in the legislative year 2012. And then the other thing that is happening, which is that we're going to be fighting, is these ag-gag bills. So 4 legislatures last year, Minnesota, Iowa, New York, and Florida, proposed bills that would criminalize taking video footage or pictures on a factory farm, make it a felony. And in Iowa and Florida, it would criminalize having or disseminating those videos or those pictures. So their solution to the problem that we've been talking about is not to improve conditions for animals. Their solution to the problem is to make it harder for us to learn about the problem. So the policy changes that Farm Sanctuary is working on with a coalition of other animal protection groups include bans on the worst of the worst confinement of animals on the confined animal feeding operations, as well as trying to ensure that we can continue to talk about these issues and get video and get photo. In conclusion, thank you very much for being here and listening to us chat about confined animal feeding operations. And Boris, thanks to you.
Thanks to all